Hey guys, welcome back to MWA Woodworks. My name is Matt, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to make and use a coping sled. Actually, two coping sleds. This one that I built out of scrap plywood, and this other one that I built out of aluminum extrusions, which I purchased and assembled myself. Now here at the table saw you can create simple frame and panel doors. I've done that many times myself, but there are a couple of disadvantages to using this method. The first one is speed. It's going to take a little while to dial in the fit of that tongue and groove joinery, and it's also going to take multiple passes across the table saw blade in order to complete the cuts. And the second thing is going to be the profile on the inside of the frame. Now when you're using a table saw to do this, that's just going to be a straight flat cut around all four sides. But if you want something decorative on the inside like a chamfer or a roundover, you're going to have to switch to these rail and style bits for your router table. Now the combination of these two bits will allow you to cut the grooves, the profile, and the joinery for your frame and panel doors. And our coping sled is going to help us cope with these. Now making the groove and the profile cut is easy. You have the long edge of the workpiece against the fence and make the cut nice and safe with some hold downs to keep everything in place. But when it's time to make the coping cuts for the mating pieces, you're cutting the end of the workpiece. This is obviously a much more precarious cut because only a very small part of the workpiece is in contact with the fence. You could use a piece of scrap to back up the cut and give the workpiece something to ride against, but there's nothing to keep it from sliding back as you make the cut and creating an ill-fitting joint. This is what the coping sled was made for, and you can see here in this demo with the workpiece backed up by a piece of scrap to prevent blowout, I can complete this cut safely and accurately. And that's what gives you a tight fit like this. The cope cut fits perfectly over the profiled edge, leaving you with a clean joint. So for the plywood coping sled, I start with a blank and use a Forstner bit to countersink holes where the T-nuts will go. I need 2 for the guidepost, 2 for the stationary fence, and 2 for the handles. Next I adjust my drill press table upward so that I can cut through holes for the center of the T-nuts. These holes will allow us to attach everything but the sliding fence. To make the sliding fence, slide, I need to first route a groove down the center of the base. It needs to be deep enough for the head of a hex bolt to slide below the surface. Then I switch to a smaller bit to cut all the way through, creating a groove for the sliding fence. Next I install my T-nuts, and one of my favorite ways to do this is by using a clamp. It makes pressing them into the plywood a breeze. Oh yeah, I ended up adding counterbores to the top so that the handles would reach the T-nuts. Those go in first, nice and sturdy. Then on goes the stationary fence with 2 bolts. Before I tighten them down all the way, I'm going to use a square to align the fence. Next I slide a hex bolt in the bottom of the groove and I add the sliding fence. And I'm using a knob to tighten the fence down. Now I add 2 standoffs that are going to act like guideposts. These have a male thread on one end and a female thread on the other. Okay, for the fence guide, I cut a piece of 6-inch polycarbonate plastic in half at the table saw. And I add a locator hole on each end, and then pick the plastic swirly piece off the drill. So with the chamfer bit and the router table, I took my own advice and trimmed every edge on this polycarbonate to avoid any more future cuts. And I added the guide to the guideposts, securing them with 2 cap nuts. I left the cap nuts loose at first and tightened the guideposts all the way down. Then I went back and tightened the cap nuts fully using a hex wrench. And last but not least, I added the clamp and give it a test. Good news, it's clampy. Now what if you don't have the scrap to build this and you don't want to buy an entire sheet of 3/4 inch plywood just to build one small jig? Well, that's where I've got you covered with version 2 of the coping sled. Now this uses all the same hardware, but it uses aluminum extrusions for the fences and the base. And that's going to make this a much more sturdy, stout jig. And it's also going to be more configurable because you can move things around in the grooves of the base. Now the only real work that's needed to be done here to these parts is to drill holes in the fences so that we can attach them to the base. I located the position of the holes with a center punch. Aluminum is a soft metal, and you may not know this, but you can cut it with regular woodworking blades and drill bits like I'm doing here. Now you can order these parts with the holes already drilled for you, but in my opinion they charge way too much for that operation, and it takes 5 minutes to do it yourself. Now let the assembly fun begin. This time I need to add the stationary fence first. Now you'll notice that I did add a small bit of 1/2 inch ply to the top of the fence, and I'll explain why later. By the way, this time I'm using sliding T-nuts to go in the grooves of the base and hold everything in place. Now like before, I use a square to get the fence lined up. Then I slide on the movable fence. Then I added the clamp. This is why I added the scrap of wood. Next I add the handles. Now there's several places you can put the handles, which is why I like this version of the sled. Same thing goes for the standoffs. And I added a regular hex nut to these because the thread was too long and it bottomed out in the groove before it was tight. So that hex nut just acts as a little bit of a spacer. Then I just added the guide and tightened it in the same order as before. Now, my indecision about the clamp came back to bite me here. You can see that the clamp head doesn't reach the workpiece because I added the ply. So I opted to make my own longer clamp head using a T-bolt and another scrap of plywood. I drilled out a pocket that the head of the bolt would fit into. I then mixed up some 5-minute epoxy and added it to the recess and then sank the head of the bolt in there and let it dry in place. Once it was dry, I went ahead and added it to the clamp, and the problem that I created that didn't have to exist to begin with was solved. Now this sled is truly a beast. It's much more stout and feels beefy, and the nice thing about the grooves in the base of the sled is that you can change configurations. And here you can see this sled in action.